do it because I'm
Right. So, yeah, I want to talk about types of attention that support mindfulness practice and to draw attention to some aspects of attention that are often sort of implicit or not really uh, obvious that we're using them. And use some neuroscience ideas to kind of amplify what I think is there in the teachings about mindfulness practice. Um, and the reason I picked this topic is because I've been interested um, in mindfulness in daily activities, um, and it's challenging to sustain mindfulness even sitting, but especially if when one's busy. And I've noticed that for me at least, it seems to depend upon the actual daily activity that's going on. Some are more challenging for mindfulness than others. And in the past, before I retired from my clinical practice, when I would go to work, and some of you work in this same field of psychotherapy, mindfulness is kind of compulsory in the therapist. And it was, I miss that. It was an essential part of my work life was to establish a mindful mind state basically at the beginning of each therapy session, because that's how you make it work. You really have to be tuned into what's actually happening and not looking at your projections about what's happening. You need to be present and allow yourself to be a little surprised by what's unfolding, and to have that benevolence, that those the benevolent heart established as well. You're there, even though maybe what the person's going through might be something that might evoke judgment or reactivity. You abstain from that, and you hold the benevolent posture to the best of your ability. Anyway, I don't do that anymore on a regular basis. I'm doing this teaching. I spend a lot of time on Zoom, bless its little heart. And I spend a lot of time on my writing and pulling weeds, and so, some things are easier to be mindful during than others. So I just was interested in what the tradition has to say about mindfulness in daily activities, and so I'm going to talk about that. I actually have been listening to Andrea Fella at the Insight Meditation Center a lot this year because she's been talking on this topic, mindfulness in daily activities. And if you're interested, they've got a lot of her talks are recorded, but she's been making 2 points that are pertinent for her um, integration of mindfulness into daily activity events. And one is that, sort of obvious that you can't just make yourself be mindful by saying, I'll be mindful now. That you sort of have to let it happen. And when you're busy doing things, you get absorbed in things and you're not going to always be mindful. But she said that it's helpful if you notice when mindfulness returns in daily activities, and to really mark it, to sort of name it silently, to cultivate the habit of paying attention to that transition of mindfulness coming back. And I think this is a good principle because what we pay attention to, we tend to get more of in our mental life. And so that's one thing. And the other thing that she's articulated consistently is a certain breadth or broadness uh, of attention, like to pay attention broadly, even if you're doing now some activities you really can't do that when you're doing your taxes, to think of something that's timely. One is often very focused and even absorbed in that process. But for many things, you can have some of your attention in a deployed broadly to the situation you're in, and that's the aspect that I think uh, I see some references to that in the suttas and in commentaries, contemporary commentaries on mindfulness practice, and also some parallels about this in modern neuroscience studies of attention. So that's what I'm going to talk about: is that breadth of attention and what that is. And I'm going to share my screen periodically, but I'll tell you one thing. It's really satisfying to talk to people who have a lot of experience with meditation because especially about something that is about practice, even if it's daily life practice. So I really welcome your thoughts about the stuff I'm about to focus on. I've got some quotes from leaders in the field, but there are lots of different perspectives on how this works. So anyway, I really would welcome your comments and thoughts about it. So even though I'm going to have PowerPoint slides up, don't hesitate to interrupt me, please, with your own perspectives. So I thought it would be good to define our terms. The poly, Maeve, are you on this? Yeah, okay. The Pali term for attention, that's usually translated as attention, is manasakara. And it's really from two words, manas, which is one of the words for mind. In the canonical tradition, there are three words that are sometimes used for mind: chitta, which is maybe thought of more as the mind, heart; manas, which is kind of more the mind as a faculty, the cognitive toolkit of the mind, skill set; and then vijnana, which is more commonly translated as consciousness or awareness, but it's also an element of, sometimes it's called mind. But this is the manas, the toolkit, the faculty of the mind. And manasi is the preposition in the mind. And then kar is the same root as for karma or sankara. It's doing or making, constructing. So manasakara is making or doing in the mind, and attention is just that. It's a doing with the mind. We aim our mind at things, our awareness, our sensitivity. Now, in Western science or in psychology and neuroscience, anyway, the first real discussion of attention was, at least in America, was by William James, who wrote the first textbook of psychology in this country. And he famously said, he's often quoted as saying, everybody knows what attention is. And it's true, we know what it is instinctively. But as people have studied it experimentally and tried to define it, it becomes very slippery to pin down exactly what it is. And there was a very nice review article on the cognitive neuroscience of attention that the title of the article was "Nobody Knows What Attention Is." It was a counterpoint to the famous James quote. And in fact, it's and the gist of that article, which I found very intellectually satisfying, is that attention is many things. And if you try to say it's one thing, you're leaving out other ways that attention shows up in our lives. And it's like a general capacity of the brain. And so let's see. Okay, I'm going to show you a few pictures of the brain, but I guess the point is that that it's not one thing, that it's many things. And what they have in common is the ability to gather information of us selectively at a given point in time in order to guide our actions in the world. And I'll just show you a few pictures now. But the brain is a massively parallel device, and it has a lot of subbrains in it. And this is a picture of an embryonic human brain. It has a forebrain, a midbrain, and a hindbrain, and then the spinal cord. And these are like little subbrains. And the embryonic human brain looks just like an embryonic fish brain. It's the basic vertebrate brain design. And then over the course of gestation and embryonic development, it turns into the more familiar human brain. It still has this hind brain, the midbrain, which stays very small in mammals, and the forebrain, which gets enormous, and that's where the cerebral cortex is. And this is the mammalian elaboration of the vertebrate brain. But I guess the point I want to make is all of the many different circuits, especially each of these subbrains has a different kind of characteristic, but they all are capable of attention in their own way. The hindbrain is a very sort of automatic kind of attention. The midbrain is more instinctive, kind of motivated attention. And then the forebrain is a little more cognitively guided, volitional attentions, etc. But they're happening simultaneously. It's not like we're just having one kind of attention one at a time, but at any given moment, different parts of our brain are paying attention to different things. And you can see that sometimes the different attentional operations are competing against each other and getting in each other's way. And I know I've shown this before, but this is called the Stroop color word task. And the task is to name aloud the color of the font in which each word is written. And if you try to do this, you've got your sound off. If you haven't done this, I suggest you try to do it, because you will discover different parts of your brain fighting with each other or competing with each other. Because we have an automatic, this is all forebrain material, because the only part of our brain that reads is the forebrain. But there are different subcircuits within that. We have a very well learned way of paying attention to letters that make words and turn those into semantic meaning. So these green letters spell out the word yellow, and it's hard to say green when you're reading yellow. Because we automatically mount our whole language circuits up to represent yellow. On the other hand, if I show it in yellow, it's very easy, because both circuits in the brain have attended to the same thing, and you can make the response. But some of these are very difficult. And if you mix them in, ones that are congruent and some that are uncongruent, it becomes very frustrating to your unconscious mind to stay on track. And this is a well-used test in psychology, and it basically taps into our ability to maintain a set of task instructions in the face of strong distractors. And in this case, the distractors are the automatic tendency to read letters and represent their meanings. So attention is many things. They're happening all at once. It's a general function of the brain. And as I mentioned, what I want to do is talk about a spectrum of these types of attention that runs from a focus on objects and details, a sort of narrow, concentrated attention, which is emphasized in samadhi type practices, concentration practices, and a broad attention to fields or situations, which is more associated with mindfulness practices, especially mindfulness with full awareness or clear comprehension, sati sampajana. So I don't want to say that these are two different things. I wanted to think of them as a spectrum from broad to narrow, narrow to broad. Because they both are relevant in our meditation practices generally. Maybe the former more for concentration and the latter more for mindfulness. Yeah. So one of the important things in our tradition is that attention is identified as a universal factor. It's always present in ordinary mind states. Attention is one of the things that's always operating. So we're always paying attention to something, and we have so many circuits that are capable of paying attention that some of them are paying attention to something all the time. And this is really different from mindfulness, even though attention is an important part of mindfulness. It's different because mindfulness, as we all know, is not always present. whereas attention of some form is. And so the key thing is that mindfulness is supported by certain kinds of attention, and I want to sort of look into what the tradition says about what kinds, especially along the spectrum of narrow to broad. So I'm going to show a few slides about that. Oops. So can you see these slides okay? I had a little weird thing happen there for me. So in the Satipatthana practice, should I sort of unpack that a little bit? Would anybody like to know more about what that is, or can I assume that you are familiar with the 4 establishments of mindfulness? Okay. Hearing no objection, I will move on. So this is one of the suttas that has the most widely cited approach to mindfulness practice. And as the introduction to each of the 4 establishments, the instruction, this is as translated by Analayo, is in regard to the body, which is the first foundation or establishment of mindfulness. In regard to the body, a monk abides contemplating the body, diligent, get my thing out of the way, clearly knowing or fully aware, mindful, free from desires and discontent in regard to the world. And just to unpack that a little bit, contemplating is an English translation of anupasati, which kind of means repeatedly seeing or closely attending. So coming back again and looking closely, but continually coming back, which is a process that I'm very familiar with in my mindfulness practice, coming back from having gotten distracted. Diligent, which is a translation of the Pali atapi, which kind of means something like sunshine, or this sustained warmth, this sustained energy like comes from the sun, sometimes translated as ardent. But this, I think, speaks to the sustained quality of our intention to practice. We stay with it. Clearly knowing or clearly comprehending or fully aware. This is some of the English translations of sampajana, which, I've seen this discussed with different shades of meaning, but I've been reading some of Joseph Goldstein's lately on this, and I really like this perspective on sampajana, that it's like seeing the big picture. It's sort of like awareness with wisdom. Things like the 3 characteristics and being aware of your own intentions in the moment are these sort of background, big picture elements to any attentional practice. And then being mindful itself, sati, which is often unpacked as recollecting the present moment. Keep continually touching in to this anchor in the present moment with an open awareness of a certain field of attention. And in case of the Satipatthana, there are these 4 establishments, and the first one is the body. So continually recollecting the present moment with open awareness in the field of the body, whether it's the breath or the elements or whatever aspect of the Satipatthana practice it is. And then free from desires and discontent. And to me, this is the quality of equanimity that is essential in mindfulness practice. Modern commentators emphasize that mindfulness has an element of benevolent caring implicit in it. It's not spelled out in these early suttas, but I think that this element, by being a way of talking about equanimity, comes the closest to the Brahma Viharas, or that element of benevolence or non-reactivity that's implicit in the Satipatthana instructions. Now, mindfulness is popular in secular settings, and the mindfulness-based stress reduction technology that was brought forth by John Kabat-Zinn is probably the most exemplar, the best exemplar of that. And John Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness this way: it's the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. And this has almost all of the same elements that we see in the Satipatthana instructions. There's this continuing attention to the unfolding of experience, which is like the contemplating, repeatedly seeing, the diligence, the atapi, paying attention on purpose. In his words, it's a motivated attention. There isn't anything in his description that I think captures the idea of sampajana, this element of wisdom, in the a backdrop of seeing the bigger picture during a mindfulness practice. But then again, it's clearly focusing on the present moment, just like in our canonical tradition, and non-judgmental, which is another way I think of talking about free from desires and discontent, or with an element of equanimity in mind. Analayo, in his book Perspectives on the Satipatthana, talks about this in plain English. Chief requirement of Satipatthana is that the practitioner remains mentally anchored in the present moment. And that present moment awareness needs to be somewhat broad or panoramic. Now, there may be a focus on the breath or on some particular element of practice, but there is also, by virtue of remaining anchored in the present moment, there is this broad or panoramic openness to what's constantly changing in that moment. Being mindful, Analayo says, is like taking a picture with a long exposure time and a wide angle lens. That's a pretty concrete statement of breadth of attention. John Peacock talks about it with some similar language. He says the mindfulness is the intention to pay attention in a particular way, the ability to recollect what's going on in the present moment. And he mentions we can do this in a fashion which is more focused, or we can do it in a wider sense. And in fact, we move along this spectrum. And because our attention is multiple at any given moment, some of our attention can be focused, while other circuits in our brain can be attending in a wider way to a broader panorama with more of a wide angle lens operation going on. And Peacock points out it's a type of attention that's fluid and flexible, not fixated on any particular object, although it may stay with objects for a time. It's not fixated. It's an open, spacious field of attention. And I think the element of sampajana, which isn't present really in some of the secular descriptions of mindfulness, this full awareness, really emphasizes the breadth. And in that breadth is an awareness of our own intentions, which are often in the background and maybe on the fringe of awareness. But with mindfulness, they're less obscure. They're more part of what we're knowing in the moment. Andy Olensky, in a commentary on the Anapanasati Sutta, says sampajana is often combined with mindfulness, and you see this phrase sati sampajana frequently in the suttas, in which case the former term, sati, refers to detailed micro-awareness, while the latter indicates a broader, more global awareness of an object as it is viewed in a wider context. So he associates the sampajana with this breadth of awareness, context. Joseph Goldstein, in his book, Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening, focuses on the awareness of our intentions, cultivating clear comprehension, sampajana, knowing what we are doing and why is a profound and transforming practice. It highlights the understanding that mindfulness is more than simply being present. With clear comprehension, we understand the motivations behind our actions. To me, this is pointing to attention to our intentions as they arise, the real inclinations of our mind, not our wishes, what we wished our intentions were, but what they actually are in any given moment. All right, I'm going to hold off on the neuroscience for a second. Yeah, so one thing about the equanimity element of mindfulness practice, to be non-reactive or non-judgmental, to be free from desires and discontents with regard to the world, in order to sustain that mind state, it really requires that we're aware of the intentions that are arising within us, because reactivity is a manifestation of intention. And if we're developed, if we've deployed attention to that aspect of the background that is our own intentions, then we can see when equanimity is going to be replaced by reactivity. We can see that happening as the intentions arise.
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Just so what you're getting to here at this last part in terms of the attention to the intention, that kind of connects more with wise or right mindfulness, or as opposed, I mean, you could have the intention to kill as many people as you can in a moment, and be mindful and do that. But in terms of our practice, where does the skillful or the right aspect come in?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. You could be very attentive and focused and do bad things. But mindfulness, as it's described in the suttas, includes this element of equanimity, which is incompatible with harmful intent. And there might be some circumstance when you might have to harm someone in a compassionate or in a skillful way just to prevent greater harm. But clearly, the intention of harmlessness has to be part of it.
Can I ask a little more on that same subject before you leave it?
Yes.
Sylvia Borstein, I heard her say that mindfulness always includes loving kindness. And which is a little bit, I guess that connects to the equanimity, but maybe you could speak about that.
Yeah. I mean, the word I use when I talk to myself about it is a benevolent heart. And so loving kindness would be in the face of another. But if I'm just sitting there with myself, the benevolence is applying kind of mainly to my own mind. And it's monkey nature. And I think equanimity, the thing in the suttas is this, sometimes it's called abiding independently at the end of the Satipatthana instructions, but at the beginning it's free from desires and discontents. And I think it's pointing at equanimity. And then when you point at equanimity, all the other of the Brahma Viharas, I think, are implied, depending on whether you're confronted with someone who's suffering, and then the appropriate response would be compassion. If they're happy, then mudita. If they're just someone you don't know much about, then friendliness. If you don't know what mind state they're in, then just friendliness. But the equanimity is the ground from which those spring, I think. Well, let me show you a few brain pictures now, because I think that the neuroscience of attention actually takes us to a similar place as some of these canonical instructions. Oh dear. Oh. There we go. Can you see that picture of the left and right eye? Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so in all of our senses, and I'm just going to use vision as an example because it's the best studied and we're so visual as a species. There are, in all of our senses, there are two main ways of formatting the information that's coming into us from the world. And in vision, uh, it's called the parvocellular pathway and the magnocellular pathway. Magno means big, and parvo means small. I can't remember whether that's Latin or Greek, but in the eye, in the retina, there are cells called retinal ganglion cells that collect information from the rods and cones. And there are two kinds of retinal ganglion cells, little ones and big ones, parvo and magno. And they have completely different jobs for vision. Parvocellular cells and the optic nerve that travels back into the brain from the eye carries the axons from those retinal ganglion cells. That pathway is especially good at determining what color something is, fine details of its shape. It has, these cells are small, and that means that they're getting a lot of information from a small spot in the retina. So they're focus cells. And they're mostly in the fovea, which is the focal point of the eye. You know, when you look straight at something, you're foveating it. You're putting the visual information on your fovea, and you can get detailed information about it. The magnocellular cells, and that part of the optic nerve, they're very big cells. They're spread out across many millimeters of retinal tissue. They're good at detecting large features. Some aspects of the world are too big to be comprehended with the parvocellular system. They're features of our situations, you know, they're the background of our experience. And this is now strictly visual, but, you know, where you are, rather than what that thing is in front of you that's little. And these cells are spread out everywhere. They're both in the fovea and in the peripheral retina. And they're particularly good at detecting motion, whereas the parvocellular system is not. It's very good at detecting things that aren't changing, you know, because it's extracting details. But the magno is sort of the change detector, and it knows how fast something's going. It's how you know to get out of the way, you know, if something suddenly starts accelerating toward you. Now, these are different cells with different shapes, and they stay separate in the optic nerve as the retina sends information into the brain. In the first place, where most of the nerve cells in the eye synapse in the brain is called the thalamus, is in the thalamus, and the thalamus has different nuclei. And it has a separate nucleus for all of our major sensory systems, and the one for vision is called the LGN, or the lateral geniculate nucleus. And it's a 6-layered nucleus in the thalamus. And the parvo and magno systems stay in their own layers. They stay in their own lanes because their jobs are so different that they have a sort of different computational architecture to make sense of focal information about objects and details versus situational contextual awareness about the situation in which we are embedded in the world. And so they stay separate in the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends large tracts of nerves up to the visual cortex, and they stay separate on their way to the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex, which is in the back of the brain. And it's only when they get there that these two channels of information start to talk to each other, and they share information, and the information is integrated and then separated again. 40% of the human brain is devoted to visual information processing. We're a super visual species. And there are two main subsections of visual processing after the primary visual cortex, and that's called the ventral stream, which moves forward from the back into the temporal lobe along the lower part of the brain and the side of the brain, and the dorsal stream, which moves over the top of the brain into the parietal cortex. And they have functions that are analogous to the functions of the parvo and magnocellular system. The temporal lobe is where we recognize objects or individual people or individual species of animals or trees or foods or tools or buildings. We know the identities of things in our ventral stream. It's expert at categorizing objects. And the dorsal stream represents situations in which we are embedded. It's this background information. and it makes a multiplicity of maps. Most of the space in the parietal part of the dorsal visual stream are maps of where things are relative to you, to the individual, the organism themselves. But we also make maps of where things are without respect to where we are, just like what's called an allocentric map, an objective map of the room we're in. Like we're all probably in a room right now. And this part of your brain in the background, not consciously, knows where everything is in this room, unless you've never been in this room before. If it's a familiar room, when you walk into it, it pulls up that map. It knows where the windows are, the doors, the whatever furniture you have. It knows where it is. And so if you need that information, it's ready because you're in that room. And so that is like just below the surface. It also, if your friend, if let's say your best friend is in the same room with you, the part of this dorsal stream is devoted to knowing where the door is relative to your friend. So it knows how your friend will get to the door if they want to go out the door. It just sort of keeps track of that. Even if it's your dog, any person, any object, any creature capable of movement, this part of the brain keeps track of where it is embedded in the situation. I don't know if this makes sense. I hope it does, but this is a kind of under the hood thing that's going on in our brain all the time. One of the things that's clear in this spectrum, I talk about it like it's a dichotomy, but it's really a spectrum. And in this area between the pink and the green, there are parts of the brain that are doing both and that are sort of in between, because not everything can be one extreme or the other. There's a lot of in-between stuff that's kind of object and kind of situation. And so this is a spectrum, but the farther you go dorsal, the more situational it is. And the farther you go ventral, the more object it is. And one thing, and you only see this in primates, it's not clear how other animals solve this same challenge of representing the world, but in primates, this is how it's done. And among the various primates, the human ventral stream is really hypertrophied. It's like a ventral stream on steroids. Sorry about that. In the thalamus, you can see there are twice as many layers devoted to this parvocellular processing as to the magnocellular processing. Our species has really evolved toward object recognition, category expertise, language, which is semantics, is kind of like a symbolizing categories of things, reducing things to their platonic essences and giving them names. And also, reification. I think this common form of delusion that humans are subject to is one of the prices we pay for having such a highly developed ventral stream, where we objectify things. We make them into objects because it's useful, and for us, we've survived very well. Other primates have a much more representation of this magnocellular, this dorsal stream type of processing. But we have it too, and I think that it's what's helping us in our mindfulness practice direct attention to situational elements. Now, this is just vision. The same distinction is present for hearing and for the body senses. In our body, we have, let's say in our hands, we have sense organs that are really good for recognizing objects. That's how blind people can read Braille. They can recognize letters by touch, and that's kind of a ventral stream type of somatosensory processing. But other of our body senses are more background, like where is my hand? That we have little sensors in our joints that tell us the angles of our joints. They don't recognize objects, but they tell us about the arrangement of things. That's more dorsal stream. And same for hearing. We can hear to recognize what's being said or what species of bird that is, or we can hear to know how far away something is. We can hear to create an embedded situation. this is a really fundamental difference in the computational demands. These circuits are quite different. And it's surprising to me that many people, even in my field, psychiatrists, are not aware of this basic spectrum of how we represent the world and how we pay attention to it. Everyone knows about the right and left hemispheres, and they're different. You know, the right hemisphere specialized for some things, left hemisphere for language, and in some ways, the left hemisphere mirrors what the ventral stream is good at, and the right hemisphere mirrors what the dorsal stream is good at. But that's not hardwired the way the ventral and dorsal stream are hardwired. If a child loses their language hemisphere very early in life because of they need surgery for some intractable problem, they grow up with only a right hemisphere, they will develop language in the right hemisphere. They don't need to have it in the left hemisphere. But if a person is blind from birth and they have their visuals, the parts of the brain that are normally devoted to vision will be taken over by body senses and hearing, the remaining major senses. Those senses will colonize the previously visual areas, but they will always respect the dorsal ventral distinction because the computational needs are different. So the dorsal stream of hearing will take over the dorsal stream of vision, but not the ventral stream of vision. The ventral stream of hearing will take over the ventral stream of vision. So I just want to make the point that this is like a fundamental spectrum that of a biological nature, this spectrum of focus to broad in how we represent the world of experience. Some other ways of talking about it, this ventral thing is like who and what, and dorsal is how and where, ventral is categorical and semantic. Dorsal enables us to act. It's an active action enabling, it's pragmatic. Ventral represents objects, the dorsal represents situations. And there's a real pragmatic element to our Dharma practice. And this one thing I should say is anatomically, the ventral stream, the object stream, has more, it has a readier access to consciousness. It's much easier to be conscious of the contents of our ventral stream. The dorsal stream is kind of in the background. It's not exactly unconscious, but it's not easily verbalized. We can put into words situational features, but we have to make an effort. They don't have names. They're sort of, we construct a way to describe them. So there's a tendency, some people say the dorsal stream is unconscious, but that's not really true. It's just not easily verbalized. It's preconscious. It's more of an intuitive awareness. Athletes are have particularly intelligent dorsal streams as a rule. They know how to engage with situations in a very coordinated way, but they can't tell you what they're doing. They can't tell you how they do that.
Hey, Rick.
Yeah.
Is it possible to think about emotive qualities overlaid with the dorsal and ventral?
Emotive qualities, did you say?
Yeah. I'm thinking about the ability to be more present in a emotional situation, as opposed to being really focused and taken away by an emotional situation.
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that. I don't want to respond without giving that some reflection.
The only reason, I kind of started thinking about it a little bit up front because of, the ability to have a broad view and I've always admired people who get into emotional situations who maintain a sense of equanimity throughout them. And so I'm just kind of wondering about the seat of all this.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, and of course the example I used was just for vision, but I think that this spectrum holds for our integrated experience of life as well. And that's where what you're saying might actually makes sense. I think it does actually make sense, that the ability to step back, and not be not one of the things that seems to sustain polarized reactivity is reification. And that is sort of an object making process. Whereas if you step back and you look at the bigger picture, it's harder to, to sustain a polarized view, I think. Especially if the bigger picture includes our own intentions, because sometimes when it's a little embarrassing sometimes to be practicing monitoring one's intentions, because some of the intentions that arise are not I'm not proud of, but when I see them explicitly rather than they're just lurking, it's easier to not sustain them, not keep feeding them.
Rick, there's a book that I haven't read, but it's called The Grieving Brain. Have you heard about that book?
I haven't even heard of it. No.
It's and one of the things that it emphasizes, and I haven't read it, but I've heard a lot about it, is that there's this mapping process that we have in our relationships to things and the way and to people. If we live with somebody and that person dies or goes away, we still have the map, and the map is we're still responding to that preconceived and embodied map of the things we do with that person, or where that person is, or it could be a loss of a job, or something that we feel we were thrown off by this, and that's a big part of what, according to this book, to the grief process.
Yeah, that I think does fit with this in the larger sense, not just a vision or hearing, but of how we make sense of our life. There's objects and there's context. And those, our loved one or our job, they're part of our context. They're part of our larger situation. And I think that's how, maybe how counseling helps, or psychotherapy helps, is that we feel the impact of a change in that context, but it's harder to name it. Because we have a bias toward the details.
Yeah, we have this expectation it's going to be what it always has been, and according to this map, and now it's not.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about the broader mind and samadhi. Can you give me an idea of attaining samadhi with the broader mind? It seems to me in my practice that with the broader mind, when I feel that my mind is open, that things, weird stuff just appears and then it disappears. So the attention is not a focus, a samadhi attention, what I would think of as a focused attention. If I gather my mind so it feels tighter, then I can sustain focus better. I don't understand. Can you address that?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great question to crowdsource too, because we have a lot of people with experience. To me, concentration, I'm thinking when you say samadhi practice, you're talking more about a concentration practice. And to me, that really, for me, that's narrowing down and really not paying attention so much to the context and the background, but a real settling into one or two things, restricting the field to a few things, and just embedding in that, and not noticing the unfolding of sensory changes in the background, really de-emphasizing them. at least informal practice. So I would say that is not that de-emphasizes the broad awareness for me. I don't know how other people view it. But there are other elements of concentration that are, I think, compatible with daily life activities. If you're not doing your taxes or something that's really sweeps you away. But
That's Stu.
that I think can coexist with a broad awareness where you really are focused, say on the body, on the breath, and walking, like on walking meditation, but you're also taking in the changes in the world around you. They're both streams are operating, and it's important to remember with attention that it's a multiplicity of functions, and it's not just one thing at a time. Although with samadhi, you restrict that multiplicity, I think.
So with the open awareness, then all this stuff, the stuff that just arises in the mind, like, I mean, all of a sudden a picture of a pig arises, or, I mean, something really dumb, something that I'm not usually aware or seeing. But it's just like my mind just has a process of its own that it does. When I opened it up, it allows, and my breath, I mean, I'm still aware of my breath, but these things just appear.
Indeed.
And I don't know if it's because I'm not mindful, or I'm mindful and so I notice it, or.
Yeah, well, I would say that just happens, I mean, that's just what's happening. It's not the fact that you notice it is evidence that you're being mindful. Now it might mean, now if you're trying to do a real deep concentration practice, then you wouldn't pay much attention to it.
Well, I don't pay any attention. I mean, it just arises and then it just poof. It's like a bubble, It arises and then poof, it's gone, and the breath is more in the forefront.
Yeah. No, that's just an object. It's just an object appearing at the sixth sense gate, like a dog barking in the hearing sense gate. Mary Helen.
The very first slide you showed a long time ago that was on the focused versus the broad. I just noticed the word bhavana at the bottom of it, and you didn't mention it. And I think of that as like development, or.
Yeah, but I think that's a word that gets translated as meditation, and so I
It does.
wanted to use a word that was neither sati nor samadhi to talk about how meditation broadly conceived includes all of these kinds of. That's why I use bhavana.
Yeah, I actually looked it up, but being on my computer, I can't help it. And and first of all, there's a movie star, but once I got past her, it did say meditation, and then later, lower down, it was about developing or becoming.
Yeah, cultivation is another.
Cultivation, right? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I see that it's 7:35, and I don't want to impose upon your time any longer, but unless you really want to see a couple more pictures, but it's up to you. Yes?
Yeah, I guess anybody who doesn't want to see them could say goodnight. I'd love to see some more pictures.
All right, I'll show you.
Dave, are you all right with that? Do you have to be anywhere?
Well, I don't have to turn this off. If I have to leave the room, I have to leave the room. But
Great.
so
Okay, well, all right. Let me put my screen back on. Although I do welcome your questions, and I'm interested in your perspective as experienced meditators as well. So here's just some pictures to illustrate the difference between the ventral and dorsal stream. you see these pictures, you ask the question, what are these things? And you get answers like blue plastic and metal, egg beater, green plastic watering can. This object information is automatically attended to, recognized in the ventral visual stream. If the question is, how can you engage with these things? The dorsal stream knows this can be held up by its handle, can be spun using the crank, you can whip cream with it, you can hold this by its handle, you fill it through its top, water plants with it. These are affordances, things you can interact with, and the dorsal stream recognizes all the affordances in your environment. And that attention is fairly automatic. And the thing about the dorsal stream and attention to affordances is that implicit in that is our possible intentions. An affordance implies that we might do something, that we might want to do something. And the affordances that we'll pay most attention to automatically will tell us something about our intentions. So I think this kind of background awareness leads into awareness of intentions. The ventral stream identifies what type of mushroom is this. The dorsal stream figures out if this is a good way to get where you're trying to go. It's a situational awareness. Blurry pictures, when you look at them, you don't know what they are. But if I bring them into focus, one or the other parts of your brain will engage with them predominantly. Here, this is a situation you're embedded in. You're actually there. There are objects in it. There's another person, there are trees, but the emphasis will be on what to do next. This, we don't know what that is, but if you bring it into focus, your ventral stream will say, oh yeah, these are a bunch of individuals. Each one's a little different. I recognize them. It's not really a situation. This is a composite photograph, but if it were, you might want to have some dog candies handy. But the ventral stream gets to work identifying the objects and individuals in this situation. The dorsal stream, it's well suited for action planning and for intuitive kinds of thinking. It's implicit. It's often called unconscious, but it's really subconscious, on the periphery of explicit languageable awareness. Many mammals have very similar skill set. Humans have this highly developed ventral stream. You can, reading letters, written language really depends upon those parvocellular systems and those abstraction generating circuits in the ventral stream. Representational memory, easy access to what we call conscious awareness and language. And it's fairly unique to humans. I think this sort of resonates a little bit with the sutta about Malonkya's questions, where he wants the Buddha to tell him if the cosmos is finite or infinite, and what happens to the body and the soul after death. And he has these questions of an abstract nature. And he tells the Buddha, I'm going to give up practice if you can't answer these questions for me, because this is what's important to me. And the Buddha instead tells him the parable about the person who's shot with a poisoned arrow. And he's lying there, and his friends come to help him, and he asks his friends, where was this arrow made? What type of poison is this? What sort of feathers were in the rear of the arrow? And his friends tell him, you need to go, someone have them pull it out. That's the dorsal stream pulls out the arrow. The ventral stream has these abstract representations it's preoccupied with. I think there's a little bit of a parallel there. Really, the Buddha's approach is a pragmatic approach, seeing what to do given our predicament. So I've been practicing with this over the last month because I've been thinking about giving this talk, and to me the situational awareness includes attention to the situation, and the present moment is, I think, is kind of a situation. It's something that's changing. It's not an object. There might be an object in it, like the breath, but present moment to me means a situation, and that's dorsal stream. And the other thing in the dorsal stream is my intentions. And so, using a picture that exemplifies the formal sitting practice, the two things in the dorsal stream are present moment experience and this intention to sit and practice mindfulness for the next half hour or whatever it is. And then in the ventral stream is an object I've selected, in this case, my breath. And I'm allowing my object, my ventral stream, to process the breath in all of its richness and detail. And the dorsal stream is keeping track of the present moment and my intention. And periodically, other objects show up, birds and dogs, and this can, or images of a pig or whatever, something pops into my mind. That the object stream handles that, but I hold the container. It's the present moment. It's mindfulness time. I have thoughts about things on my to-do list, that are important, but this isn't the right time for it. Go back to it doesn't interrupt the continuity of my mindfulness, until, of course, it does interrupt the continuity of my mindfulness, and I'm really preoccupied with this problem at work. And what changes is my intention. My intention now is to figure out what to say to Jerry about this problem at work. That's now my intention. And a moment later, I'm no longer in the present moment. I've fabricated a situation where I can talk to Jerry. And even though I'm still sitting on this chair, that's not the situation that's holding my attention. I've made up a situation, and I've figured out a good way to get Jerry to not create some problems with the other team members about this thing he's going to do. The objects in this now in my mind are these people, Jerry and Crystal, who he's about to offend if he doesn't handle this. My intention is to solve this problem, and my dorsal stream is in Fantasyland. It's in an imaginary place. And then something happens, a dog barks, or I feel the furrowed brow pinching and causing me pain, and I come back to the present moment. And now what's changed is my goal. The intention is now supplanting the old, to practice is supplanting the attention to solve that problem. I can do that later. And this fantasy is now just an object that's receding. It's no longer the situation I'm in. I'm looking at it as that's something my mind conjured up. I'm actually sitting here, breathing in and breathing out. So that's I think that's, oh yeah, I did have one other thing. I found this sutta that I'd never heard of before, called the Bhikkhunu Pasaya Sutta. It's like the Bhikkhuni's abode or something. And the Buddha is addressing a group of nuns who are doing satipatthana practice. And he gives them this instruction. I'll just read it to you. And it's what to do if your mind gets distracted. For one who is abiding, contemplating body as body, bodily object arises, or bodily distress or mental sluggishness that scatters his mind outward, or in my case, thinking about some other problem I have to solve. If this happens, the monk should direct his mind to some satisfactory image, and the Pali is pasadaniya nimitta. Pasada, I think of as a serene confidence, and nimitta as an image or a sign or something we're very familiar with. When the mind is directed to some satisfactory image, happiness is born. From this happiness, joy is born. And then with a joyful mind, the body relaxes. A relaxed mind feels content. The mind of one content becomes concentrated. He then reflects, the purpose for which I directed my mind has been accomplished. So I shall now withdraw directed attention from the image. Withdraws, no longer thinks upon or thinks about this serene image. He understands, I'm not thinking upon or thinking about anything. Inwardly mindful, I am content. This is directed meditation. What is undirected meditation? Not directing the mind outward. A monk understands my mind is not directed outward. He understands not focused on before or after. Free, undirected. And he understands I abide observing body as body, in the case of Satipatthana establishment number 1. Ardent, fully aware, mindful, I am content. This is undirected meditation. To me, this picks up this sort of open awareness and there's a time to use a focus, to pick an object and focus on it, to dispel the distraction that has pulled you away. If you know, as sometimes happens, something comes up and it just dominates my mind for long periods of time, and I have a very unfulfilling sit. And this instruction is, when that happens, to pull out an image of serene confidence, something associated with the Dharma, is how the commentaries talk about this. And that will change your body state and your mind state, and just long enough that you move off of that mind state that was sustaining the distraction and come back to the undirected meditation practice. I won't go on any further than that, but I just wanted to share that sutta with you because I had never seen it before, and thought it was kind of useful.
It's great.
Any other comments or questions before we have to?
Well, the first one, the directed one, reminded me of Analayo's saying in the fourth foundation of mindfulness that the only two dhammas that really matter are the hindrances and the seven factors, and that was really describing the hindrances and the seven factors.
Yeah. Right.
Rick, I lost my connection at one point, but are you going to make the slides available?
I'd be happy to if anybody would like them.
And this is being recorded too, so, and I'm going to stop the recording now. So.